This oral history of North County physicians and Palomar Hospital is brought to you by the David Hoffman Society for Medical History. Dr. Lynn Sheffey, a former president of the San Diego County Medical Society, assisted by Doctors Oliver Thomas and Lee Human, are presenting.
Hello, and welcome to Escondido. Today we have an oral history session here. We're very happy to have Dr. Oliver Thomas here, who will start the session. And Ollie's been here since in town since 1956, and retired about 2001, I believe. Lee Human is here, and I believe, Lee, you got here about 1966, is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, and he practiced for 30 years. I arrived in town in 1969 and retired in 2007, I believe. So why don't we start out with Ollie and just have you kind of tell us some things about maybe your early life, Ollie, and where you went to school, where you grew up, and where you went to college, med school, residency, and how you got to San Diego.
I was a Midwestern kid, grew up just across the fence from a farm, and went to school at high school in Hastings, Nebraska, and about the time I was going to graduate from high school, I got into the Navy. I was taken into what's called the V-12 program. Can you hear me all right? At that time, I was just starting at UCLA, sponsored by the V-12 program. They were paying all the fees and so on. So I really enjoyed my practice or my time as a student at UCLA. I got a letter from the Navy saying that I was going to be assigned to the Naval Retraining Command up in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area.
That's after med school, isn't it? You went to med school at Stanford?
Yes, this is after that.
Okay.
And so I showed up there, and they said, well, what kind of training do you want? And I said, well, I wanted to be in a residency, and a surgical residency. So they said, well, here you are at this retraining command, which turned out to be a prison for Navy guys who were drafted and didn't want to be in the Navy, so they acted up and so on and got thrown into jail. He strongly suggested, knowing what my interests were, that once we got out of the Navy, I should get a residency in internal medicine at the Kaiser Hospital in Oakland. So that's what I did when I got out of the Navy, and I spent 2 good years in the Kaiser training program, in 1956 I was acquainted with Vista and Escondido and the North County area, and I asked if I could be a part of the program with the county hospital. So there was a group of 2 visiting men, people in practice here in San Diego, who were very cordial and picked me up and helped me learn what I needed to learn. I decided in 1956, I was married, we had a child, decided it's time to start my practice in a small town, Escondido. And I wrote letters to 5 different general practitioners in Escondido, asking about what are the possibilities of a new general physician to come into Escondido. Well, I didn't get any answers from the ones in Vista, and I got several answers from Escondido. One was from Dr. David Winkler, who turned out to be a fine physician, well trained in New York City, as a matter of fact. And he took me in and was very cordial and introduced me to all the important doctors that I should know in Escondido. And we started in practice. Lynn was here, and he joined our group.
I came later,
Yeah.
69.
In 69, yeah. And I learned from my consultants, and I consulted with Lee Human, who was a great teacher. And we took on new doctors as the years went by, and here we are.
Why don't you tell us something about maybe your early days working in the emergency room there, when you were trying to build your practice after you first started out?
Well, that was the usual way for a new doctor to come to town, get on the emergency room list, and so there were 5 or 6 of us who did this, and new people were moving into Escondido, and many times if they had no physician, they were assigned to one of us. And that's the way I built my practice. And Dave Winkler gave me a lot of good patients. So that's the way I was lucky. I got in with a really good doctor.
So now, you remember Dr. Bernie Graybill, who practiced here in town for many years, and wasn't there a story about him and the police department?
Yeah, he lived on a hill overlooking.
It was right up here, wasn't it?
Well,
Pretty
it
close
was somewhere around there, overlooking Escondido. And if he got a call from the emergency room, Bernie never drove slowly. He liked to drive fast. He liked to do everything fast. And he got so many tickets driving down the hill to come to Palomar Hospital to see somebody that the policeman finally said, well, forget it. They put a sign up, and it got to be known as please drive slowly sign, is Dr. Graybill's sign.
Dr. Graybill's on the way?
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, Escondido was a nice town, little town, and a lot of nice people here. And my wife and I got acquainted quickly, and really enjoyed our time. I finally retired in the year 2000.
Did you ever play golf with Grable?
Yeah, no, not golf. I played tennis with him.
Well, you played golf with Grable, he'd make a round of 18 holes in 2 hours. But you ran from the tee to ball like that. He played golf faster than anybody in the world.
Yeah.
So Lee, would you like to kind of pick it up now and maybe just kind of talk about your early life and where you went to school and how you got into your specialty and how you got to Escondido?
I was raised in Los Angeles and went to USC, both undergraduate and medical school, and did my residency training at what was then LA County Hospital, is now USC Medical Center. Interrupted in the middle back 3 years in France in the Air Force, which was a tough assignment. When I finished my residency and one-year fellowship in nephrology, I was looking for a place to practice, and Bob Peacock was here and invited me to join him, and I did. Things were a lot different then than they are now. When I came to town in '66, I was one of 2 internists. There weren't any of the subspecialties in those days. Hospital was small and the medical staff was correspondingly small. And in the 40 plus years that followed, I've watched an explosion of medicine and radical changes in every way that you can think of. Back in those days, the medical community was very tight-knit. The medical staff all worked at the hospital, admitted their own patients, and were all involved in committee work and medical staff affairs. Those things have changed rather radically in the years that followed. I was involved in the establishment of the first mental health unit in the hospital. I created the first hemodialysis unit in the hospital. We established the first monitored beds. It was a coronary care unit originally, and then expanded to become a general ICU. I started up and chaired for many years the Quality Management Committee and subsequently the Utilization Review Committee. When I was Chief of Staff, the Joint Commission told us we had to departmentalize the medical staff or they wouldn't pass our next inspection, so I had to rewrite the bylaws. I was very involved for many years in medical staff affairs.
Now, did you take call from home for the ER, and have nurses there, or were you physically in the ER?
Well, I took call from home theoretically, but as a matter of fact, when I was on call, I spent it at the hospital, sometimes bunking in a spare room. As time went on, it became increasingly difficult to get physicians to pull call in the ER, particularly the surgical subspecialists. Subsidies were paid for a long time. Maybe they still are, for all I know. But that was relieved a lot by the development of emergency room physicians. Now the latest thing is that we have hospitalists, so that many primary care physicians don't go to the hospital anymore. Their patients are admitted by hospitalists or by emergency room doctors and cared for by hospitalists. What else? The hemodialysis unit in the hospital became too small, so I built one as an outpatient, and on an outpatient basis, and then subsequently the one in the hospital was closed down.
Lee, let me add in, Lee talked about rewriting the bylaws. I was Chief of Staff at that time when he rewrote the bylaws. Jim Bulin and he and I rewrote the bylaws over at Jim Bulin's house, and Jim and I got into the business of sampling Jim's wine, which he made right next door, and Lee wrote the whole bylaws by himself.
So thank you, Lee. I'd like to take a little bit of a detour maybe before I tell my story and go back and talk about the very early history of medicine in Escondido. And there are a couple of books. I have one book in the back, Hidden Valley Heritage by Alan McGrew. Escondido's First 100 Years was written in 1988. And there's a section on the medical history of Escondido. And then I also used an article from the Escondido magazine, spring 2011, by Wendy Barker, The Growth of Escondido's Hospitals. So initially talking about the early doctors, Escondido did have horse and buggy doctors, and Escondido was incorporated in 1888. And the same year, Dr. David Kreis and his son came to town. And his son actually practiced into the 1920s. Another early doctor was Dr. John Larzerlaire, who arrived in 1898. His son also practiced into the 1920s. And there's